take your protein pills. The Poisoned Electrick Head story. Brian Carney. Chapter 13, Malice in Krustyland, continued. Some way down the path, we encountered a small stage where two girls were swirling and wailing in the midst of a cacophonous day-glow assault on the senses. Their gender was evident, their attractiveness less so. The frantic lighting arrangements possibly contributed to their veiled sexual allure, but more likely that they appeared to be covered from head to foot in bits of old kitchen appliances. It was as if two magnetic Carol Deckers had taken an ill-advised stroll through a scrapyard before curtain up. I can still remember the song. It went, "If you want to turn me on, turn my TV on." They were called Screech Rock. Some things stay in the memory. That fucked up scene certainly has. After a while, we wandered back up to the van, where someone had lit a campfire, and the usual suspects were congregated around it, along with a guy I didn't recognise. I began babbling on about how what we'd just witnessed was either the best thing I'd ever seen or the worst, when the stranger interrupted me with what sounded like backward speech. "I leak your belt," he intoned with a weighted seriousness, triggering a huge flashback to The Boy from Space, an educational serial I watched at primary school, which featured an intergalactic albino kid whose speech came out in reverse. He repeated his garbled statement a second time, then a third, but each time all I could manage in response was a stunned, "Huh?" as the irritability grew behind his Freddy and the Dreamer's specs. I was floundering madly by this point, but the others were of no assistance. They'd adopted the muted silence of gang members watching a Hells Angels power struggle in an early Jack Nicholson flick, their averted eyes staring lifelessly at the flickering flames. "Do you hoof to say it again?" he demanded. Wait a minute, that was almost coherent. But I answered in all honesty, yes, he would have to say it again, because it was still a synaptic, unintelligible blurt, when suddenly everything shifted into focus. And with a sickening lurch, I realised I was talking to a Scotsman who liked my belt. Bastard! What was there to like about it? It was just an old studded leather one, round studs evenly spaced with some missing. But he continued by asking me if I'd ever counted them, and that maybe I should because it might be a good number. Give me strength. I made a mental note of putting that little job at the top of my things-to-do list, in case life should decide to throw any more psychotic Caledonian numerologists my way. Made my excuses and faded into the night. Later on, it began raining in earnest, and we thought about finding places to crash out for the night. Some of our entourage had haphazardly erected tents, and there was also some room in the van. The previous night had caused us no such concerns, for on arrival we'd staggered out of the van into the mild night, drunk to a man, and collapsed en masse under a huge tarpaulin. The gargantuan intake of booze on the way down had transformed the lumpy ground into duck-down mattresses with silk sheets. The morning had of course brought cold, backache, dehydration, and a relentless swarm of midges that threatened to gnaw our exposed heads down to the very gristle. This experience was the inspiration for the song Cap of Flies. This night, however, was an altogether more pressing concern, and I was unsure which way to jump when Bingo offered me a place in his tent. An offer I readily accepted, so we bedded down in the burly adequate protection from what was now a storm, exhaustion once more papering over the cracks of discomfort. I awoke a few hours later, dimly aware that from the waist down we were both underwater. And grim a discovery as this was, in my mind it didn't merit getting out of the sleeping bag. The way I figured it was we had nowhere else to go, so clinging on to some short-lived comfort was preferable to succumbing to the alternative. And as long as Bingo was unaware of the crisis, why disturb him? This skewed logic lasted a few precious minutes until Bingo's alarm sensors fought their way to the nerve centre, overpowered the alcohol particles that were having a little party in there, and pulled the emergency cord. The effect was instantaneous and impressive as he jerked bolt upright and launched into a volley of his trademark exclamation noises, a collection of whistles and snorts that had somewhere along the line replaced conventional word-based communication with a kind of sonic shorthand. St Helens is rich in these sub-dialects that borrow liberally from the world of birdsong and bat sonar. In stark contrast to Bingo, we had another acquaintance to whom enunciation was of the highest priority, and the normal, habitual tailing off of sentences was objectionable. For Jimmy Benson, syllable stress was an absolute, and there would be no half measures accepted. He was the nightclub doorman of communication. No words would be allowed in unless properly attired. It wasn't that he didn't understand you, it was more that he thought you were keeping some of it back for yourself, creaming some off the top to line your own pocket before handing it over. So you quickly developed a crisp, perfect diction around him. In such a small-town scene, it was inevitable that one day the two would meet, and predictably it happened at the Dead Fly Studios. Can't you just picture Jimmy's reaction to Bingo's Morse code semaphore? The two ricocheted off each other, each amplifying the other's peculiarity, matter meeting antimatter, until it resulted in an imploding black hole of communication failure. The desperate circumstances we were in, and frequent exposure to Skippy the bush kangaroo as a child, meant that Bingo's message was clear. It was time to abandon tent, so out we scrambled from rock to hard place, from the cold wet confines of the tent to the cold wet expanses of the exposed plains, where we kicked around a while in our sopping clothes and waited for daylight. If my memory serves me correctly, we eventually played on the stage later that day, the only fact to corroborate this being a dim memory of Bill not relishing the experience, as he dropped acid a few hours earlier, expecting another day of twiddling his thumbs. What he got instead was several thousand spectators, as he struggled to perform complex rhythmic tasks, in a state best suited for stirring at your thumbs and finding stunning alien sunrises in the cuticles. How it all sounded is anybody's guess. I think the important thing was that it sounded, full stop. It would be churlish to import quality values on the whole thing. We were in a bloody field. Normally, the most complicated thing you're required to pull off there is erecting a tent. Well, we tried that, and look how successful we were. So in my mind, this was miraculous. Not to say that the most people could expect were shoddy performances. It was often quite the reverse, and that was the real magic of it. That and the fact that it would only exist in the memories of those present. The Manamobile studio was conspicuous by its absence. I don't ever recall even seeing as much as a dictaphone. Priceless performances casually tossed into the ether for the benefit of England's indifferent great unwashed. Yet, despite this beauty in the face of adversity, it wasn't always appreciated. The sheer, insurmountable logistics of the operation often passed some people by, as they stood before the stage in moral outrage, demanding to be entertained. Amongst the electric shocks, generator failures, and intermittent lighting, verbal abuse from drunken crusties was the one thing always in plentiful supply. "Fucking get on with it, I want music," was the usual cry. And as we scrambled around in semi-darkness trying to locate cables and sockets, it was hard not to indulge in mental retorts worthy of Basil Fawlty at his most scathing. "I do apologise on behalf of the management, sir, that at this late stage the entertainment has been unavoidably delayed. I do hope, sir's seats are sufficiently close to the orchestra pit and that the Dom Perignon is suitably chilled. But might I just point out to sir, if I may, that we are in the middle of a fucking field." The stage owners were probably hardened to this attitude. I suppose it came with the territory. Incidentally, Ribble Head was our first encounter with Wang O'Reilly's travelling stage, a brightly coloured touring truck reminiscent of Midwestern medicine shows. There was something magical about it with its vaudevillian writing on the side and cheery, altruistic owners Scouse and Marge. At this gathering we had little contact with them, but at further festivals, and there were many due to AF's tireless efforts, and as this one had made such an impact, we got to know them quite well. Marge was of Anglo-French parentage and looked like Virginie Le Doyen, her effortless beauty always seeming a severe juxtaposition to the mud-caked cybertrogs in every other direction. What was a nice girl like this doing running a mobile free stage for the anarcho-squat counterculture? Who knows, but after some reluctance, AF's Scouse accent had initially put her off. She'd had some previous bother with Northerners once. She gave us a go, loved it, and after that we were always welcome. One time they invited us down to Glastonbury to appear on the stage. The catch being, it was the day after the festival ended. That year, we'd had neither the money nor energy to organise going there as paying customers. But this I wasn't sure about. Being a long-time Glastonbury lover, I'd always felt a twinge, well, more like a spasm of regret, whenever it was on and I wasn't present, which became increasingly hard to bear with the onset of televised ones. So you can imagine the sinking feeling brought on by driving on site when it's all over. The only people around were the litter pickers, and the air resonated with the ghost of several thousand people's recently had good time. The deal was that the travellers, who at this stage in the game were still allowed to attend for free, were going to stick around for a few days before moving on. So wangos and assorted bands were going to entertain them. Not long after arriving, we found ourselves taking the stage and setting up for a mid-afternoon performance, daylight reducing the technical hassles a little, and soon we were almost ready to rock. At this point, a guy meandered on stage, spotted my setup and made a beeline for it, muttering, "Oh, keyboards, let's have a go," as he pushed past me and began pushing buttons merrily. Now this was another thing you were always having to deal with, the self-gratification dude. Oblivious to the bigger picture, these guys bumbled around, determined to give their inner child a day to remember. I looked around and everyone was ready to start, but over in my corner, Mr. Early Learning Centre was in full swing. In exasperation, I grabbed him and probably told him to sling his hook, which I'll admit isn't the friendliest of approaches, but as you can imagine, my stress levels were fairly juiced up. He reeled back in surprise and horror, then looking me square in the eyes, said, "Whoa, bad karma, bad karma." And my eyes were suddenly drawn to a big green stone on a string around his neck. Tired of this crap, I pushed him aside and we began the set, my composure now not at its best. After the show, we sat down by the van. Bun was emptying his pockets, looking for something, and I noticed his dead fly keys on the grass. This made me check my own pockets, and I found my own set, which wasn't good, as I'd arranged to leave them at my parents' place so that our friend Kath could run the place in our absence. The slow realisation of this oversight and its repercussions began to sink in. Kath would have spent a fractious hour with my folks looking for non-existent keys before having to go up to the studios at regular intervals to turn people away. In this pre-mobile phone era, there was nothing to be done but imagine the sheer number of pissed-off people as a result of my ineptitude. Wow, if this was bad karma at work, I was impressed at how fast-acting it was. I'd always presumed that some past infraction would be revisited on you years later, the forces of cosmic justice taking their own sweet time to balance the books. But no, it was quicker than magic mushroom tea. He should have said instant karma, but then maybe he wasn't a Lennon fan. The next few days were spent in the usual fashion, lounging around and drinking in the sun, interspersed with occasional performances for a disinterested crowd. It was the tail end of June and a scorcher, so it was no surprise to stumble upon a berry-brown Bill, snoozing bare-torsoed in the afternoon sun. He was splayed out in a drunken stupor, mouth open, with a half-consumed can in his hand, a pile of other empties and several bags of rubbish beside him. He'd not picked a great spot for a siesta. He'd probably only sat down to tie his boots or something, and the alcohol had seized its chance. But rather than leave him there, we thought we'd at least make him blend in, so we arranged a few items of rubbish around him and over him. The game soon caught on, and before long he'd all but disappeared under the mountain of trash. One thing was certain, though, someone would be in for a pummeling when the giant eventually woke. And this happened sooner than we anticipated, when a tow truck reversed over his foot. It was a possibility we hadn't allowed for, just as the driver had anticipated no problem in backing up so close to a pile of rubbish. The effect was immediate and alarming, like a candid camera stunt where a statue suddenly swipes your ice cream cone. Except this was Trasho, the demon of the dump, emerging from the refuse like a big irate tattooed Godzilla. We were a little concerned, but only for our own safety. It was just another one of our stupid pranks that didn't quite merit medical attention. These borderline injuries had become so common that it was almost bad form to gripe about them. Bill tottered around a bit looking for someone to swing at, then hobbled off, grumbling to himself to locate another beer. There were no bones broken, and the incident disappeared into the forgotten injury file, along with joke brandings from dashboard lighters, setting newspapers on fire while someone's reading them, and all manner of minor concussion. The post-Glastonbury festival eventually dwindled away, but we were destined to return in the future, and this time it would be before the gates even opened. Chapter 14, where the children dance to the pipes of Pan. In the free festival calendar, Stonehenge was the daddy of them all, on the June summer solstice. A long-standing draw for the counterculture and the even longer-standing monolith. It had had its wings clipped in 85 when the police waded in to prevent a gathering that year, smashing trucks and terrorising women and babies in a desperate attempt to kill the movement dead. Word had it that common law decreed the land would revert to the public after 20 consecutive gatherings, so the full might of the establishment was wielded. This was in a more naive age when law enforcement still basked in its image of a bobby's chin strap and a clip round the ear for stealing a rosy apple. The atrocities of the miners' strike seen as a brief aberration. Hence, abuses of power went unreported or were twisted by the media, and images of dirty work-shy hippies picking fights with the police weren't about to win the sympathies of any tabloid reader. Drugged-out weirdos and freaks in outlandish garb, spouting pagan claptrap and clambering all over our English heritage was clearly not part of the vision of brave new Thatcherite Britain. But enough about the Druids. Nevertheless, the spirit of the Stones lived on, despite exclusion zones and on-the-spot arrests. So when we were invited down to a gathering in 1989, we thought we'd give it a go. By then, it had become a festival somewhere in the region of Stonehenge, no one ever really knowing where it would take place after the fractious cat-and-mouse games with the authorities. But we were lucky and were amongst the few that managed to gather in Chalderton Woods, some 5 miles away from the monument. We suspected there was a larger contingent getting it on somewhere else, and that we'd hooked up with a splinter group of desperados seeking refuge in the forest. But it transpired that this small group was all that had made it. So this was it then, the sole outpost of defiance. That we made it there at all was a miracle. Had AF's dogged perseverance not been on hand to drag and claw us into the heart of the woods, we would have turned back hours earlier. Fortunately, speed was coursing through his veins, lighting his eyes up like a pinball machine, and he had the bits firmly between his teeth, well, what was left of them, grinding them together furiously, his bottom jaw swinging side to side like a cakewalk. He popped out of the van at every pause to peep over tree stumps and bushes like some crazed prairie dog, determined to find a way in through the dense undergrowth. We trundled down what appeared to be a path, but it was heavy going, frequently causing the engine to squeal and the wheels to spin as they failed to make traction. Then, after what appeared to be some progress, we came across a fallen tree blocking our route. AF surveyed the scene, then bounded off into the woods, following the direction of the path. Deep within the forest, someone must have got the ear-bashing of their lives, because before long he returned, accompanied by 2 guys with chainsaws, who set about hacking the tree into manageable chunks, and quite swiftly we were moving again. Somewhere down the line, Bone from the Mongs climbed into the passenger seat, relieved to see we'd made it and eager to direct us toward their makeshift stage. Displaying a dedication we could only dream about, they always managed to cobble one together, even if it usually played second fiddle to Wang O'Reilly's or some other more professional effort. Still, it meant they always got to play for as long and as often as they wanted. This time, though, their efforts had paid off in spades, as no one else had even got close. En route, the next obstacle we encountered was someone's vehicle blocking our passage, and when Billy prompted AF to tell them to move, Bone snapped, saying, "We will not tell them to move, we will ask them to move, all right." That was us all over, laying the law down in a lawless zone, and forever losing our heads when the situation got chaotic. But Bone was just the opposite. He floated through festival sites exuding Buddhist calm and tolerance, completely in tune with the diplomacy and etiquette required to avoid getting a good kicking, yet always the first to protest at disharmonious behaviour, which often resulted in him getting one anyway. At Ribble Head, he'd peacefully implored the incoming traffic to slow down for the sake of the dogs running about, and had been attacked with an iron bar for his troubles. And AF once witnessed him intervene in the chopping down of a tree at a party in Liverpool, when some drunken biker made towards it with an axe as the fire was growing low. Bone put his head against the trunk, directly in the axe's path, telling him that he'd have to do him first. And as AF noted at the time, that took some balls. Eventually, we trundled into the heart of the woods, just by the Mongolia stage, and parked up. It was a strange atmosphere, being so hemmed in and close, with a half-twilight already reigning in the middle of the afternoon, making it simultaneously intimate and threatening. In the midst of our customary explorations, I stumbled across the son of our family doctor, who was skulking around shaven-headed and wide-eyed. And though he seemed surprised to see me, he didn't stick around to catch up on old times, preferring to stealthily scarper at the first opportunity. Next, we were set upon by feral kids who playfully tried to rifle our pockets as the sozzled dad looked on proudly. But undeterred, we shook them off and tried to blend into an atmosphere that was part Robin Hood and part Star Wars Rebel Outpost. And before long, night fell for real, and we discussed taking to the stage. It was no mean feat carting the equipment through the cramped twilight trees, both for fear of what we might stumble over and who we might stumble upon. A huge shifty character lurking by the stage eyed Bun's bass guitar with a childlike blend of curiosity and excitement, the way King Kong looked at Fay Ray, before timidly asking if he could have a go. It was the classic literary scene of the wide-eyed brute with the strength of 10 men, but the innocent temperament of a toddler, as immortalised in the works of John Steinbeck and Mary Shelley. And faced with such pathos, Bun was ill-equipped to refuse and handed the instrument over. The grubby colossus gingerly placed the strap over his head, gleefully slapped the strings level 42 style, then all at once began briskly striding away into the trees. Bun was momentarily nonplussed, but then gave pursuit, catching him up a few yards away, where he gently but firmly extricated it from the giant's grasp without recourse. All of us aware of how many other less savoury alternative endings that little scene could have played out into. The combination of circumstances, atmosphere, and location meant that the performance was tinged with primal energy, the woods creating a weird acoustic effect that was both contained and claustrophobic, yet wide open and far-reaching, and the ambience was topped off with the probing searchlights of a police helicopter, mercilessly scanning the stage area. The music merged with the errant wind-blown rustling of the trees, the sound of the chopper blades, and the insistent but impotent megaphone pleas of its occupants, as several hundred V-signs shot up in response. The pilot's empty rhetoric about trespassing and demands to leave the site immediately only served to galvanise everyone's resistance further, and probably contributed to what happened after the concert. Directly after the final number, a fired-up rebel-rouser took to the mic and whipped the crowd into frenzy with his battle cry to take to the stones. Adrian Bell was amongst the crowd, and this is his version of events taken from his Stonehenge website.
Summer solstice, a typical 1980s story. So we walked into Amesbury, and there an amazing gathering took place in the car park. People and vehicles kept arriving, and word had got round that there was a camp in Colleton Woods, which was just outside the 4-mile exclusion zone. Eventually, at least 50 of us set off walking whilst the same amount again set off in vehicles. The camp, when we got there, was already large, and at this stage the vibes were actually rather good. That year there was no Glastonbury, which swelled our ranks considerably, and despite police saying that no one else would be allowed on site, more and more kept arriving. There were hundreds of vehicles, and estimates as to the amount of people there went up to around the 5,000 mark. It certainly seemed busier than in 1985, when there'd been about between 1,500 and 3,000, and still the people kept coming. Wandering around the woods was quite some experience. A stage had been set up, and with a generator, and this time the best band by far were called Poisoned Electrick Head. Obviously, it is appropriate to mention Poisoned Electric Head at this stage, I feel. They took to the stage directly after a site meeting which had been right by the actual stage area, and I noticed as they were sound checking, well, before they even started to sound check, that there were 7 of them, 2 singers, 2 guitarists, keyboards, bass and drums. So I thought, this lot are going to be proggy, got to be. The sound check confirmed this, and I thought, I have to be right at the front for this. So I did. I got myself down the front there and boogied away in the dust. What a fantastic night it was. I also remember thinking at the time that they were a little bit like a combination of Cardiacs and Gong, which is one of the best combinations you could possibly ever have, I would say. So they got a new fan. I do remember as well, a couple of days afterwards, going on to Hammersmith Clown and Ballroom. I hitchhiked out there to see Cardiacs, and I saw Tim Quay, the percussionist, as we were carting gear up the stairs. I used to do that. That was my way of getting into Cardiacs gigs for free. So, and I mentioned to Tim Quay that I'd seen Poisoned Electric Head, and he went, yes, I think they sent us a tape. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, that all adds up, that makes sense. Anyway, getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So let's go back to Calderton Woods, either side of Poisoned Electric Head. Throughout all my time there was tension with the police, as threats of raids and evictions proliferated. Come the night/morning of the solstice, the majority of the camp set off on foot to Stonehenge, just as Culture Shock were taken to the stage, so there was a cracking atmosphere. Noticeable was there were no police escort, whereas we'd had one in 1987. The police had escorted us all the way from our camp in Shipton Bellinger all the way to Stonehenge. This time, nothing. So, as we hit the road, over to our right we could see a long row of headlights coming down the hill, and they were being trailed by a police helicopter with its searchlight, and we all knew that this was the remainder of the peace convoy that hadn't made it onto our site. So a huge cheer went up down the road. By the time we got onto the A303 and onto the Countess roundabout, the peace convoy had obviously got there ahead of us, and the most breathtaking scene was there to behold. The convoy vehicles were all parked up on the roundabout itself, and every exit was blocked by council gritting lorries. Still, no police though. Also worth mentioning that in amongst all these vehicles there was horses tethered, shire horses that were tethered, and chickens running around. So these were obviously people that lived on the road the year round, and they'd been forced to abandon their vehicles at the Countess roundabout, which was about a mile and a little bit from Stonehenge. So, once we'd got over being breath took by this scene, we carried on walking towards Stonehenge, and just over a mile on, there we found them, the police. About 1,000 of them, waiting for us at the Stonehenge monument. More people arrived until thousands of us were gathered in the road by the monument. Sadly, trouble was brewing and the atmosphere was definitely deteriorating, and the crowd by the Heelstone seemed hell-bent on violence. It climbed on top of it and started throwing missiles whilst waving their big black anarchy flag. As it got worse, the police went back to their vans in relays, returning in full riot gear. Meanwhile, a police helicopter circled above, blaring out the warning, The crowd around the hailstone, you must disperse. You must disperse, or officers will be sent amongst you to make arrests. When I saw a petrol bomb flying into the police ranks, followed by a security fence, I knew it was time to get out of the way. I headed towards the car park where I asked the police if I was dispersed enough. All this at 4 o'clock in the morning. Surreal doesn't even begin to describe it, especially considering that the Druids were doing their thing in the middle of it all. I then watched in horror as the mounted police baton charged the crowd. Don't let anyone tell you that this didn't happen. I saw the blooded heads and bruises of conflict. But despite the horror of it, I couldn't help feeling that a minority of our group had brought the trouble upon themselves and upon us. Watching the crowd swarm back across Salisbury Plain was like watching herds of wildebeest, and all the while the Druids carried on their ceremony.
Some of us went on the doomed march, with most of us choosing to stay in the woods until the next morning, when the eviction notice arrived and we were escorted out by less than sympathetic police, who were still smarting from the events a few hours earlier. But oh, how they danced, the little people of Stonehenge. Chapter 15. Doe. So, a brief chapter encapsulating Homer Simpson's monosyllabic but eloquent verbalization of kicking oneself. Because for every proud declaration of I was there lurks half a dozen instances when history actually came calling and we were hiding behind the door pretending to be out. On deaf ears. Though most of our business went on in-house, the Dead Fly occasionally dabbled in equipment rental, which, like most of our services, was ill-conceived and underpriced. There was no contingency plan for loss or damage, or even a hefty deposit. If we did business on any basis, I'd have to say it was on complicity. Our customers were musicians, and so were we. So we naively assumed they intended to make music, and not a killing at our expense. Thus we rented out £100 microphones to complete strangers, with no firm guarantee of seeing either again. One guy who took advantage of this service managed a Liverpool band and needed extra mics for recording purposes. After a few visits, he gave us a demo tape of their stuff, and being so full of self-belief in their material, we did the decent thing and gave it a fair listen. It was indeed full of catchy tunes and quite likeable, though not really our thing, so we kept it on the office shelf, occasionally playing it to regulars who were of a jingly-jangly persuasion. Old art college buddy Dave Evans liked it so much that we gave it to him, seeing it as an object of little value. Years later, when the album came out to international acclaim, the songs had hardly changed from their original demo arrangement, and we recognised them all. I suppose that's the sign of good timeless pop tunes, which is as good a way as any to describe the Lars. Transmission failure. 1979 in the Manchester Youth Theatre props department. We're sitting there lackadaisically putting axe heads on poles for the battle scene in Henry V. The girl beside me is an early incarnation of what we now know as goth, an unduly harshly ridiculed group if you ask me, probably because they're the last bastion against the soul-consuming, greed-propelled, immoral, individuality-erasing, Aldous Huxley was right onslaught of sportswear companies. Yeah, it's one of my bugbears. She was all in black and not the cheeriest flower in the garden by any means. I ask her about the badge she's wearing, mildly intrigued by the words on it. She tells me it's a local band she's into. If I'm interested, they're playing at the weekend, so I agree to go along and check them out, being young and uncynical and open to new experiences. When I replay the scene in my head, that's the version I forlornly indulge in. But here's how the conversation really went. What's that supposed to mean? Indicating badge. It's a band. Sullen and defensive. Are they any good then? Stifling a snigger. Well, I like them, by now wishing I'd leave her alone instead of relentlessly taking the piss. Yeah, right. Look, leave me alone if you can't be civil. Woohoo, more tissues in a strop. And similar digs from a 15-year-old raised on baiting and needling as a means of expression. St. Helens, my glorious finishing school. What a debt I owe you. So I didn't end up joining her to explore the potential of her fave band, choosing to pour scorn on her on a daily basis instead. And the name of the band, didn't I mention that? 2 words. Joy Division. Except us. The dead fly attracted bits of musical gear like a mohair jumper attracts fluff. I guess people bought or nicked things, lost interest after a few weeks and offloaded them onto us. Lend it, try it out, buy it if you're interested, keep hold of it for a few weeks. What the fuck does it do? Help me, pay me when you've got the readies, etc. More often than not, we were quite taken with these gizmos and gadgets, having time on our hands and an inquisitive streak, but one little box baffled us with its uselessness. It resembled a drum machine but played only bass lines, and frankly, sounded bugger all like a bass guitar. Its lack of feasible applications meant it sat on the window ledge for months before we begged the owner to take it away as it was gathering dust. Had Fatboy Slim expressed the sentiment, "Everybody needs one," back then, we would have laughed in his face, but the TR-303 went on to single-handedly define the sound of acid house and techno. So, in conclusion, that poor Decca executive who knocked back the Beatles, saying guitar bands are on the way out, gets an unfairly hard time of it. In many ways, he was right. He just said it 20 years too soon. We'd all be better off with a crystal ball. Just as all those folk who told us we were fools to be jumping around in matching black boiler suits and creepy masks never imagined that 10 years later, kids would all be going apeshit over Slipknot.
Poisoned electric, poisoned electric head, poisoned electric head, 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 poisoned electric.